Dear colleagues and friends, it is a pleasure to welcome you again at our virtual environmental ergonomics session, which today, as you all know, will focus on chronobiology, jet lag, and travel fatigue. As you know, we are organizing these virtual environmental ergonomics seminars together with Stephen and Chris, and we have been going on for 2 seasons. And I think that we kicked off on April the 16th last year. And I would just like to share with you before we start our now infamous Wall of Fame for season 1, which is here. As you can see, we hosted a lot of excellent speakers on a lot of different environmental ergonomics and physiology topics. And now we're in season 2 already running, updating as we go our Wall of Fame. As you know, all of our talks are recorded, and if you want to revisit any of them, you can always visit our webpage, ice2021.com, where under the tab past events, you can find all of the recordings. And also, in addition to that, you can find the teaching handouts, which can be used for purposes of lecturing studies and can be used by students and lecturers alike. We want to emphasize the educational aspect of our meeting, so that's really important that we can also have this side of things covered. Before we go to the topic of today's talk, I would just like to remind you of our upcoming talks. Obviously, we have some planned in the near future. As you know, now we're running every 14 days, so every other week. And the next one, which will be focused on free diving physiology, we will have a Canadian duo, Anthony and Alex, and they will talk about different aspects of free diving, which you know is relatively an extreme endeavor. And then we have a really special session planned for March 4th, when writer, outside columnist, and best-selling author of Endure, Alex Hutchinson, I guess you've heard of him, will join us. And the topic will be rather specific. We mostly focus on the science and scientific aspects. And this time, the idea will be that he will share his valuable insights on how scientists should approach science communication and how we can improve. And I think it's really something that also Stephen is, thinking a lot about and doing on that side of things, some really good work. And we need to do better in terms of this science communication, how to disseminate our work to the general public, not only in terms of this dissemination of our work, but also to make people value and understand science, which is really important in these days, as you can see. Okay, so then coming back to the session today, it's really a big pleasure, obviously, to welcome the 2 speakers that we have, which are experts on the topic with lots of work in that regard. And the first one today will be our second returning speaker, actually, Dr. Shawnda Morrison, who we featured in the first ever virtual ICEE seminar, and she will talk about the chronobiology, about the basics, and give a basic overview, which will introduce us then to the next speaker, which is Professor Christa Janse van Rensburg from Pretoria. And she will have a more of an applied talk on different aspects and how to beat jet lag or how to tackle jet lag and travel fatigue. And I'm particularly happy to welcome Christa to our sessions, because I believe she's the first speaker coming to our sessions from the beautiful South Africa. So it's a pleasure to have you with us. Before I hand it over to Shawnda, I would just like to remind you that we highly encourage you to get engaged in the presentations, and you will be able to do so during the talks via the Q&A feature. We will remind you during the talk, but nevertheless. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please share them with us, and we will communicate that with the speakers. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Shawnda. Thank you very much, Shawnda.
Thank you so much. I will share the screen here. Okay, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I hope everyone can hear me all right. And if so, then we'll get underway. For the last couple of years, I've had the pleasure of investigating sleep and sleep physiology in great detail. And it's something that I think a lot of environmental physiologists are not often thinking about in this way. So I'm really pleased to be able to present some of the preliminary introduction to chronobiology, body temperature, the basics of sleep physiology, and then give some examples from research that we've done here in Slovenia on sleep at high altitude and some sleeping disorders. The topic today is on jet lag. This will be near the end of my talk. If you'll bear with me, I'd like to do a little bit of the background to why we sleep and how we sleep, and set up the second speaker in that way. So in terms of chronobiology, we've got a few terms here to get under our belt. Chronobiology is really just the study of all biological rhythms, and it's really well tied to the endocrine system, which is cycling through various aspects of our body. The circadian rhythm refers to changes in daily activities that are endogenously regulated and repeated over approximately 24 to 25-hour timeframes. So in the absence of external stimuli, if you take away the sun or food or other external rhythms and you just allow people to sleep when they feel tired, they will often slip from a 24-hour circadian rhythm to slightly more, closer to 25 hours, which is very interesting in terms of maintaining your rhythms and your attention throughout the day. Endogenous rhythms refer to internally controlled structures like body temperature. Our body temperature oscillates approximately 1 degree throughout the day, and I'll show you some examples of that. And exogenous rhythms, this is referring to external stimuli, and this could be either sunlight or food, when we eat, noise, or social interactions. So these are the external rhythms of our day, and not having to do with what is going on physiologically inside our body per se. This figure is taken from, or borrowed rather, from an upcoming version of Dr. Stephen Chung's new textbook on advanced environmental exercise physiology, so I thank him for that. And it's important to note, if we look at this feature, this figure at the bottom right-hand side, we have environmental light rhythm. This acts on our sleep-wake cycle in two possible ways. The first is through the pineal gland, which regulates melatonin release, and it affects directly the hypothalamic suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is just a grouping of cells that is considered the molecular clock, and it's located in the hypothalamus, which is, as we also know for environmental physiology, the seat of control for thermoregulation and neuroendocrine function. So it can react to the pineal gland, but also environmental light can hit your retinohypothalamic tract. And this can also act on that SNC group of molecules. And so in this way, light hitting your eye can have a very significant impact on the hypothalamus and your sleep-wake cycle. When we're talking about circadian rhythms, these change from childhood to adulthood as well. So this graph is showing what happens as we age from age 2, 8, 14, and age 20. And there are 3 colored bars here. The red one is depicting core body temperature, which you can see stays steady throughout the day and then decreases at night, reaching its nadir between 3 and 4 a.m. You also have cortisol secretions These peak in the mid-morning time frame, and then you have melatonin secretion, and this begins to rise in that late evening phase. So each of these three components are linked together and can affect the other significantly. There was a series of studies looking at the question of whether core body temperature affects sleep onset from a research group, Crouchy et al. In the late 90s, early 2000s. And this is a picture, a figure depicting, they did a study where they were looking at people who were sleep deprived and people who were not. And they were recording what happened to their core, heart rate, and skin temperatures. And what they did was placed thermistors on the proximal and distal ends of the limb, so on your finger and forearm, or your toe and calf. And they wanted to see whether people were vasodilating or vasoconstricting, whether or not this was affecting sleep. So if you look at the bottom panel on the far right-hand side, this is core body temperature, and this is in the people with sleep deprivation. They were not allowed to fall asleep at night. And you can see that the nadir of the response of core body temperature, it doesn't dip as low as you would normally expect to see it when you have a normal night's sleep. And this can have repercussions for military personnel, people who are doing missions 24 hours a day, medical personnel who are on call in hospitals. When you are continuing to function without sleep, it can affect more than just attention or cognitive function. It can also affect core body temperature as well. They did a few follow-up studies looking at whether you can drive this response. And if you have warm feet, for example, if you wear very warm socks, can you change or drive the response such that your sleep onset will be altered? And in fact, they found that this was true. This graph depicts the distal proximal skin temperature gradients, changes that are occurring. And the green dots, the high ones are depicting less change. So they have warmer hands and feet. And those people who have warmer hands and feet, they have a sleep onset latency that's a lot less. So that means that people are able to fall asleep faster than people who have cold hands and feet. If we move on to sleep physiology as a discipline, there's a great quote from the Scottish play that opens the scoring manual from the American Association of Sleep Medicine. I thought with a very technical manual, learning how to evaluate sleep, they would start with some, I don't know, technical or definition, but they started with a cultural phenomenon where they describe sleep as something that is critical for functioning of everyday life. And the definition of sleep, in fact, is nothing more than a desired state of unconsciousness. So this is something that is completely normal, and the actual definition is no more than or less than that. It's just a desired state of unconsciousness. So you, by definition, do not know when you are asleep or not. Sleep physiology is a relatively new discipline. The first recordings of the brain were not until the late 1800s, and the first investigation of sleep that incorporated breathing wasn't until the 20th century. Breathing interruptions during sleep, people who are snoring, people who are have obstructive sleep apnea or central sleep apnea, they're not able to have regular rhythmic breathing at night. This was not investigated until 1963. When we're assessing sleep, you can do so in three different ways. You can be qualitative, quantitative, or the gold standard polysomnography. So if you guys will permit me, I would like you to think at home what you were thinking in terms of how sleepy you are. So this is called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. It's one of the most popular scales you can use. So think to yourself right now and rank out of 0 to 3. What are the chances that you're going to fall asleep doing these particular activities? Okay, so 3 means you're definitely going to fall asleep and have a doze. and 0 means you're absolutely alert and you will not fall asleep. So have a think. What is your situation for sitting and reading? We're just going to sum these. Sitting and reading, watching television, sitting inactive in a public place, as a passenger in a car for an hour without a break, that's my 3. Lying down to rest in the afternoon when circumstances permit, sitting and talking to someone, sitting quietly after lunch without alcohol, and in a car while stopped for a few minutes driving. So have a think what your total would be. And if your total is from 1 to 6, congratulations, you are getting enough sleep. If it's around 7 or 8, your score is average, but if you are 9+, it means you're very sleepy and should seek medical attention. So a lot of students that I'm doing this class with, there are a lot of students who are 9+ just by the way that they are behaving and having to study, having to work, all their responsibilities. And there's a lot of literature right now, just on a side note, with the effects of COVID and all of the self-isolation. This is a whole new topic that we can discuss in the question period later, if you like. Okay, in terms of quantitative, so that's qualitative. There are a number of different tools you can use to assess how well you're sleeping, but these are really limited because, as we just mentioned, the definition is that it's the desired state of unconsciousness. So you yourself should not know and you actually do not know how much you're sleeping, how well you're sleeping, how long you're sleeping. Everyone has a general idea, but it's a very crude measure. So to get a better measure, you would want to do quantitative measurements. And this picture is an example of polygraphy and actigraphy. This uses measurements that will measure counts or movements of the body. And it's usually done in conjunction with SpO2 measures as well. So this is a classic example of someone you can see they're active during the day. Each strip is a different day of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So this is a half a month of data. And the blue bars are just showing where the person is asleep. And this particular person is waking up sort of in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom or to do something. You can see every night they're waking up about the same time. This is a very good method for getting a gross general idea of how people are sleeping, whether they are immobile throughout the night. But it is not good for actually defining the different characteristics of sleep. For that, you need to do polysomnography, which is looking at brain EEG, muscle EMG, the respiratory effort of breathing. You need to incorporate nasal airflow, because if someone's having trouble breathing at night, they could be obstructed at the level of the nose or some of the upper airways, or it could be centrally motivated, and you need to have all 3 sites in order to define what kind of problems they're having. You need to have EMG on the eyes to see about rapid eye movement, changes in dreaming patterns, heart rate, oxygen saturation, and oftentimes people who are sleeping in a laboratory, you'll have video as well. So you can, and audio, so you can correlate, or you can cross-reference changes in snoring and other things that happen to the traces that you get. So here's an example of what you would see on your computer screen. And the top panel are the eyes, the right and left eye channels. Then you've got the frontal, central, and occipital areas of the brain. You've got leg movements, the different airflow channels, breathing in and out throughout the night, ECG, and the oxygen saturation levels. And it's with all of these in conjunction that we are able to determine at what stage of sleep people are at any given moment. These traces go on for an entire 8-hour period of time, and researchers evaluate them in every 30-second chunks of time. So it takes a really long time to analyze and evaluate sleep. There are, of course, automatic ways of doing that, but they still make quite a few errors. So you do need that human check to double check what is happening at any given stage. I'm going to go through each of the different stages very briefly, and then we'll get into more of the applied part of the talk. So there are two phases of sleep. The first is non-REM sleep, and the second is REM sleep. And these textbooks and the sleep literature really emphasize the fact that each stage of consciousness is very different from the one before. So moving from wakefulness to non-REM sleep is just as different as moving from non-REM to REM sleep or REM to wakefulness. Those are three completely different states of being in terms of how to think of the physiology. So as we move into sleep, the very first stage, stage one, this is the light initial stage of sleep, where the muscles relax, the brain waves become a little more irregular and rapid, and it lasts about 5 to 10 minutes. It's just the first introduction to sleeping. You're just starting to doze off. If there's a bright light or a loud sound, you'll wake up for sure. Typically, you move from stage one to stage two, and this is still considered light sleep, but there are bursts of electrical activity in these EEG complexes that include spindles, K complexes, and you're looking as someone studying this when you're starting to see those bursts of electrical activity. For stage three sleep, you see in the EEG channels that you've got very large, slow brain waves in the delta frequency. This would be very hard to wake up from. Stage three sleep is the very deep restorative sleep, and it generally occurs in the first half of the night more often, whereas REM occurs in the second half of the night. REM sleep is sometimes called paradoxical sleep because it looks like you're awake. The EEG channels look more like waking state than sleeping, but all of your muscle activity is completely reduced. And it's very important when you're scoring these REM sleep stages that you look at the eye channels, which I've underlined above. When you can see movement there in the eye channels, that is required in order to score whether or not something is REM or non-REM. So now that we have scored our file and we know how long people are staying in a given sleep phase, we can create a sleep hypnogram. And this is basically a picture of how long people stay in any given stage. So this is one that was generated from some of the bed rest research that we were doing here in Slovenia, where there is a certain amount of time someone is awake, so that's the W, and then they drop into the N1, the stage 1, 2, 3 is deep sleep, and R is the REM dreaming phase. And you can see that they kind of go down into the deep phase for some time, 30, 40 minutes, and then they cycle back up. And this is completely normal. This is a good sleep output. They are sleeping essentially from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. And the awakenings, the times that you see the sleep hypnogram where the line is going right up to the W, the top again, these are so short in duration that the person is probably not awake to see or understand what is happening. Okay, so now that we've done all of that predefined work, we can start talking about sleep in terms of sleep quality and what's happening in different disease states, how people are feeling, different environments, etc. So when I talk about sleep architecture, this is the proportion of time that someone is spending in each of those stages. Total sleep time is a standardized term that means once you have the lights out in the room, it's the total amount of time that you've been sleeping, but this does not include a term called wake after sleep onset. So in a lab, if I'm testing people how well they're sleeping, you have a standardized time to turn the lights off, and then the people fall asleep, and then every time they wake up for a certain period of time, you sum those scores, and that's the total amount of time they've been awake after they first fell asleep. And that is an important number to have, because you don't want the wake after sleep onset to be a large number. You want to make sure people are sleeping well and consistently through the night. Sleep latency, this is lights out to sleep onset. So you turn the lights off. How long does it take you typically to fall asleep? That's what that means. Sleep efficiency is the amount of sleep time that you're in bed from time of lights out. So if you have a really high sleep latency, if it takes you a really long time to fall asleep, then you will not be a very efficient sleeper. And the stage shifts are the number of times there is a change in that sleep stage. So you're moving from stage 1, 2, 3, REM, back up, down, up, down, up. The number of times this changes is also a variable that we are counting. At the end of the day, sleep architecture changes throughout the lifetime as well. And in this, sorry about the font, it's a bit small, but on the x-axis, you have age from age 5 to 85. And the different colors on this graph represent the amount of time you're spending in that given stage. So the first gray bar is the sleep latency. It normally takes people between 5 and 10 minutes to fall asleep at night. After you've decided to fall asleep, you're in bed, you turn the light off, you're lying down, it should be between 5 and 10 minutes. If it's over 10 minutes, then you should think about what is keeping you up at night. The second bar is the wake after sleep onset, and you can see that this gets much wider as you get much older. And the proportion of time that you spend in REM dreaming is about the same. It decreases a little bit, but have a look at the black band, the slow wave sleep. This decreases a lot as you get older, especially from age 55 on. Okay, this is the sleeping disorders part of the talk. I'm going to talk very briefly about sleep breathing disorders and hypoxia, since this is a talk for environmental ergonomics folks. One slide on insomnia, the definition, and then get into some of the circadian rhythm disorders. Okay, so sleep and breathing we know are affected when newcomers travel to high altitude, but they're not as present in people who live there. And we know that high altitude, when you go to high altitude, this can produce really poor quality sleep. And there are complex interactions with why that is. It seems that even in people who sleep poorly at sea level, who have obstructive sleep apnea, who are snoring and they have problems in their soft palate, for example, when they move to high altitude, the change, they have less of the obstruction and more of the central sleep apnea when they're exposed to high altitude, anything over 3,000 meters. The nocturnal periodic breathing that you see increases during acclimatization over the course of more than 2 weeks. And there are very few studies that are using all of those wires and the full gold standard polysomnography equipment, mostly because it's just so difficult to transport and use in these harsh environments. But there are some studies who have done it. Most recently, Phil Ainsley's group was doing a series of studies at Everest Base Camp and Pyramid Lab. We've done some studies looking at bed rest and hypoxia here in Slovenia. And there's been quite a bit of work done in Antarctica at one of their research stations there. Some of the first work using actual polysomnography was done in the United States through the Usarium Lab. This is from 1974, and this is one subject who went up to approximately 4,300 meters at Pikes Peak. And the first graph, you see the hypnogram of like at sea level, and then the second one you can see just visually that they have many more stage shifts, and that there's much less time spent in that lower deep sleep, that level 3 or 4 sleep, which is very important. So many nights of this consecutively will affect mood state, concentration, reaction time, all sorts of physiological variables. Some work that we did here in Planica, we were looking at whether exercise would help or hinder these night periodic breathing problems. And so we did a study with subjects who spent 10 days at normobaric hypoxia. So they were at sea level, but we were adjusting the composition of the air within the training facility. and to be at the equivalent of about 4,000 meters altitude. We had two groups. One group was an exerciser group and one who exercised cycled for 1 hour each day. Or was it two? Tade can correct me. And anyway, they were cycling for an extended period of time each day. And then there was a control group. And if you had to guess which group was the control group and which group was the exercising group for night 1 and night 10 of this intervention, before I ran the study, I would have certainly thought that people who had more apnea-hypopneas, that's the y-axis here, the number of events that they are not able to breathe properly during the night, I certainly would have thought that the exerciser group would have been the black bar, night 1, night 10. But in fact, it's not. The exercisers were the ones who had worse breathing and loop gain in a hypoxic environment compared to the people who were not exercising. However, this was only 10 days duration. So we were interested in seeing whether this trend was true for long periods of time. To answer this question, we did a study looking at a 12-month period of time, people who lived and worked at Concordia Research Base in Antarctica. This is a research base that's located on the high Antarctic plateau. And we found that the people who were stationed there for 1 year continually still had very high levels of the apnea-hypopnea occurring each night. So it did not matter if they were there for 10 days, 1 month, or 12 months. Those events were continuing every single night. The SpO2 values, of course, from night 1 to 10 in our study increased, and this was a good example of an acclimation effect to the high altitude, but then that stabilized, and after 12 months in Concordia, the rates did not improve. The Concordia group, the people who were there, some people naturally really wanted to exercise and enjoyed exercising, and they kept very detailed exercise logs, and other people did not. So what we did was separate the group into exercisers versus non-exercisers and calculated the average exercise bout each day. And this graph is showing you the mean number of apnea-hypopnea events. Again, this is bad. If you have lots each night, it means you're stopping breathing throughout the night, every few minutes. And we correlated that to the mean exercise bout, and we found a very significant correlation between the two. So this graph is showing you basically that the people who are exercising the most, self-reported, are also experiencing the most periodic breathing at night. There are many other sleeping disorders. It's an entire discipline in neurobiology. One problematic disease state is insomnia, and this is because it can be either idiopathic, meaning that it is its own thing, or it can result from a disease state. Depression, anxiety, medications, many other non-communicable diseases will have insomnia as a cofactor. In order to qualify for someone to have insomnia, they need to have an inability to sleep regular periods of time, at minimum of 7 hours in one go. They need to wake up, and at the end of their waking time, they do not feel rested. And this must be persistent over time. So it's really important to be diagnosed with insomnia. It can't just be a couple of days, 1 week, 2 weeks. It actually, the definition requires many months in this state. Of course, light emitting devices affect sleep onset really critically, and sleep efficiency. So tablets, phones, laptops, anytime you have screen watching after the hour of about 6 p.m., it will affect some of the sleep efficiency and sleep quality data. There's an entire branch of sleep problems that are called circadian rhythm disorders. So we know that some people just naturally like waking up very early in the morning, and some people like staying up very late at night. To qualify as a lark or an owl, if you sleep in after 10 a.m. regularly and you're up after midnight naturally, very easily, then you would be considered an owl. Whereas a lark, they like getting up at around 5 a.m., even as early as 4:30 a.m. If you're getting up before 4 a.m. though, this is problematic, and you would want to seek medical attention to help adjust your clock so that you're waking up in around that 5 a.m. zone. That would be considered a lark. Sleep patterns have a strong component to them, and sleep onset occurs usually with melatonin release and the reduction of core temperatures in that natural binaural rhythm, as we saw in one of those first slides. You can have questionnaires that you can do online to help determine which chronotype you are. And circadian rhythm disorders are fairly common. You can have a phase advance or a phase delay. A phase delay is often what students have, where they are delayed in falling asleep. So they're sleeping at 2, 3, 4 a.m. and they're not waking up until well after noon. You can also have the condition where you have a free running or blind situation. So here's some actigraphy. Every line again is a different day of the week. And the little counts, the black part are counts. This is when the person is awake, and the blank spaces are when they're asleep. And you can see that every day, this is being shifted between 15 and 30 minutes continuously. And so this is an example of someone who is blind, where the retinal input is not acting on that SMC complex properly. And these people have a really hard time studying, holding down a job, because in order to force their circadian rhythm into the social norms of their given society, it's almost impossible for them to do over a very long period of time. Jet lag is considered one of these chronobiology offsets, and it's typically occurs when you're crossing more than 3 time zones. The general rule of thumb is that in order to get over jet lag and feel more like yourself, it takes approximately 1 day per hour that you have been traveling. So when I was doing my PhD in New Zealand, this was 15-hour time difference, and it takes quite some days to get over that feeling of needing to fall asleep in the middle of the day. It's also an issue for shift workers, athletes, business travelers, military. Recently, some colleagues and I, we were interested in looking at what is the effect of dehydration on long haul, after long haul flights on athletic performance. We were interested because the air cabin environment presents a very unique situation where, depending on the length of your flight, you could be significantly dehydrating during your flight to and from a given place. And this is because the air cabin pressure in the environment is kept at 2,500 meter equivalent. So it provides a mild hypoxic stimulus, one that can actually be measured in SpO2 content when people arrive to their destination. The cabin air humidity is very dry, so this can increase water loss, especially through respiration. And you also have chair rest deconditioning. You have to stay in your seat for such a long period of time that this affects fluid balance. It can reduce the urge to void the bladder. You are often drinking coffee, tea, or other fluids that further promote water loss. And you also have a lot of fluid redistribution that occurs. So you've got gravity that's pulling fluid to the feet, and it may increase the risk of deep vein thrombosis. Unfortunately, with this study, there is almost no literature looking at this in a quantitative way, measuring athletes before and after their flights. So the jury is still out on the real effects of the air cabin environment. One of the last slides I wanted to bring up, and then we'll hand it over, sorry, I'm a bit over time here, is social jet lag. This is a new term. It was only coined around 2009. And this is the phenomenon where people are going to bed later and waking up later on the weekends alone. So it's social jet lag because you're going out, you're partying with your friends. You think, oh, I'm just going to catch up on my sleep. It is absolutely impossible from a physiological standpoint to catch up on sleep. Once you've lost those hours at a given night, they're just gone, and now you're just sleep deprived. So there's really no difference between social jet lag and sleep deprivation. The two are practical. Like normal jet lag, it's a consequence of forcing your body to shift between two time zones, work and social obligations versus your internal circadian clock. And an interesting statistics I came across in one of the review articles was that 2/3 of us experience at least 1 hour of social jet lag every week. And 1/3 experience 2 hours or more. So this is equivalent to traveling from London to Tel Aviv and back every week. It's a huge strain on the body and something that is completely avoidable. The final point to bring up is how much jet lag are we talking about? The definition from some of these articles, it says anything greater than 3 hours duration one way or the other can be problematic. But in fact, it's less than that. Daylight savings time is when we artificially move the clock's 1 hour difference. And certain regions of the world do this and others do not. And this is a brand new article that was just released at the end of 2020. And it is a position stand from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And they are advocating that we should abolish this tradition because daylight savings time, the day after the clocks change, these days are associated with increased collision, traffic accidents. There are problems with circadian misalignment. This can be associated with increased cardiovascular risk. People have more heart attacks on the next day, metabolic syndrome, and other health risks. And so there's a large body of evidence that has now been accumulated over the last, say, 10 or 15 years that are showing seasonal time changes should be abolished in favor of a fixed national year-round standard time, because all of these changes are easily avoidable. Finally, there are many therapy options for circadian disorders, including melatonin supplementation, blue light therapy, exercise, when you eat, and I'm sure the next speaker will delve into those more. Finally, to have good sleep hygiene, this is something that I think every person should be cognizant of, especially during the self-isolation measures, the increased screen time, decreased physical activity, increased sedentary time, you name it. All of us need to pay more attention to how we sleep, how well we sleep, and when we sleep. So it's important to go to bed at the same time every night. Go to bed only when you plan to sleep. So no screen time in the actual bed. Just go there, lights out, and go there to sleep. Make sure you wake up every time at around the same time, because 1 hour makes a big difference. If you're used to getting up at 8 or 9 a.m. for your work, continue to do that on the weekend. I know it's not as fun, but it would make a big difference in your health, metabolic health, cardiovascular health in the long run. If you have a difficult time going to bed after 2100, do some exercise. If you have a difficult time going to sleep before, limit your light exposure after 6 p.m. So those are just some tips. And I believe this is it. The last thing is just a quick note. If you are interested in this line of research, check out the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, AASM, or the European Sleep Research Society. I especially recommend ESRS. They have a lot of grant options for young scientists. You can learn more about the field. They have position stands and lots of contacts that are very valuable. And finally, a shameless plug for the upcoming Advanced Environmental Exercise Physiology textbook that Stephen and Phil Ainsley have written. I'm really excited to have been a small, very, very small part of that on the Chronobiology chapter. And I think it's a great addition to anyone's library here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shawnda. I've taken over from today. it's amazing, isn't it, that we all sleep, but we all know very little about it. So most of that was the first time I'd heard any of that. Couple of quick questions from me just about sleep, and then a couple from the audience, and then we will get to the second talk. But you showed that the pattern of stages shifted throughout the lifespan. So as you got older, things happened. But are they pretty so if I was measured, say for example, for 7 days in a row, and I have pretty standard days, am I quite consistent amongst myself in a small period of time about those phases of the stages of sleep?
Yes, absolutely you are.
Yeah, cool. Didn't know that. And are there any differences in the consequences of being woken in different stages of sleep?
Oh, that's a good question. My short answer would be no. It would be very difficult to wake someone from the very deep sleep. So if you have young children or you yourself have experienced, you have to actually physically move them, wake them, shout, pinch their ear a little bit in that stage 3 sleep. And then when you do get out of it, you might not know where you are, and there are certain pharmacological issues going on as well. So yes, if you were going to be woken up at certain times, that absolutely has lingering effects, let's say.
The last one from me, I saw that setup of how you measure the sort of the full suite of measurements for sleep. From a practical logistic point of view, how easy is it to sleep with all of that?
Great question.
Going on?
Every time you do a study like this, you do 1 night of familiarization because the subjects or the participants really have a very difficult time. And one thing I would note as well is that it is important to have that EEG cap that has the frontal, middle, and occipital especially. Right now, there's a lot of devices, Fitbits, etc., that claim to measure sleep. And I just wanted your audience and you guys to know that that's great as a marker of whether you're lying still or not, but they cannot assess whether or not you are actually sleeping and in what stage you are, because they do not have those occipital channels. And even little headbands, we've used some devices in these bed rest studies for that exact reason, to try and get around the logistics of it. But a lot of the ambulatory units now that were being done in these high altitude or bed rest scenarios, they are a little bit better. So you don't have the entire cap. You might have only 2 places at each zone instead of like 50. So they are a little more user friendly, but yeah, it takes some practice.
Great. And then one from one of the attendees that said, first of all, thanks for a wonderful talk, Dr. Morrison. They wanted to know whether it's possible to transition or change between larks and owls. They kind of use the example of like a New Year resolution about whether you can actually deliberately change that pattern.
You can absolutely change your pattern, and you can get used to that new zone. But for example, I'm a nighthawk. My whole family is, my grandmother is, and you know, if I have to get up and train, or if I'm running a study and I'm getting up at 5 a.m., I can feel a little better and go to bed at 8, you know, but I'm never going to be the one that's like, ooh, the sun is rising. You know, you don't get to that phase. You get to like a tolerable state where you're competent at that hour. But yeah, go for the New Year's resolution. But if I had a New Year's resolution, I would just say, choose a consistent time more than anything else.
Great, thank you. There are actually a number of questions in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I think we'll shift on. And so Shawnda can answer those some of those Q&As in the chat. And I think some of them will be quite nice general questions at the end as well. But thanks very much for that, Shawnda. Covered a lot of ground, gave us a great introduction.
Yeah, thanks.
And I'd like to welcome Christa to the stage, please, if you'd like to share your screen.
Thank you, Chris. And good evening, colleagues, and maybe even good morning to some. I'm not sure. We're at different areas in the world. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thank you, Shawnda, for setting the scene for my talk that will really be a clinical and an application of jet lag management. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to just shortly define jet lag. Then we will look at some important facts that we need to keep in mind when we travel, and of course to differentiate between travel fatigue and jet lag. Then we will sort of have a discussion on why the travel direction is important. And then, of course, the nice part, how do we beat jet lag? And I have an example of a travel scenario that we can go through. And maybe just before I start, and this is just to let you not ask me difficult questions, I'm not a physiologist or a sleep scientist, I'm a clinician researcher. So let's jump into jet lag. We know that it is a state of desynchronosis, and as Shawnda explained, usually because of rapid air travel across more than 3 time zones. Now, that will cause your circadian rhythm or your internal body clock to be out of sync with that of your external environment. And we'll go a bit more into detail on why the dim light melatonin onset and the minimum core body temperature is important, because that will go out of sync and it will have a lot of effects on your body signals like eating, sleeping, and when you wake up. The fact is that we need to keep in mind before we travel that some of those you won't be able to control. So better be aware of them and plan for them. And that will be things like the passenger next to you. We all have them. You know, the person sitting sort of on top of you when you try to have your supper. The confined space that you're moving in. You can't do anything about the length of the flight and how many time zones you cross. Also the poor air quality for that time that you're spending in the cabin and the air pressure fluctuations. Perhaps you can do a bit on, stopovers in your journey planning, but again, if there are delays, it's not in your control. Neither will be the turbulence of the plane if you have bad weather on your way there, or the vibration and the noise in the cabin that you can experience. So what can we control? So beforehand, when you plan your journey, you need to get rid of all this anxiety. Most definitely one can plan what and when you're going to eat. Uh, the importance of hydration has been alluded to by Shawnda. So it is very, very important to take more liquids in, also to keep you moving, to have that need to void. The timing of your sleep will be important, and there are a debate going on about that, and I'll catch up on that a bit later in the talk. And then the body temperature. We know that you sleep best when your core body temperature is at its minimum, and as Shawnda stated from that study in Nature, is that perhaps going on the plane, we know that they drop the temperature. They want the passengers to go to sleep because then you're not disturbing them, you're not asking for drinks and eats. So think of that, packing your bag, that you should take something to perhaps warm you up if you want to stay awake while you are flying, to then try and adapt to the destination time. And then the movement and activity really have to do with prevention of deep venous thrombosis. A few other things that we need to take in mind is that you may now also have seasonal changes when you travel from the northern to the southern hemisphere, or the other way around. It may be hot where you're living, and then it suddenly is cold when we arrive in Europe from South Africa, for example, in this time of year. The humidity that we know may be a problem for the athletes during the Tokyo Olympics, where they have a high humidity. Pollution, and that can be air pollution, it can be noise pollution. So do your research before you just venture off to a new destination. And then, of course, pathogenic organisms, your drinking water, and all of that. So what we need to also remember is not that only travel fatigue and jet lag is different from each other, but also consider that you don't want to contract any other illness, because that will make your symptoms of travel fatigue and jet lag more severe and longer lasting. Then do something about motion sickness. If you know that you are prone to that, take something when you board the plane. And in fact, it may also, those medications may help you to feel more sleepy when you want to be sleepy on the plane. And I've already mentioned deep venous thrombosis. So think of compression socks and compression garments while you fly. So what is the difference between travel fatigue and jet lag? Travel fatigue will be a temporary exhaustion or tiredness that can follow any long journey, and that will be irrespective of the mode of transport. So it can be by bus, it can be by train, and of course by plane, but that will mostly then be if you go north-south and not west-east more than 3 time zones like what we have in jet lag. Jet lag, on the other hand, as I've just said, is a temporary out of sync with the environment. Your internal body clock is not in sync, and that is because of the dark light cycle that is different from your home time. And this will follow after rapid long distance travel. And in jet lag's case, the direction of the flight will be more important than the length of the flight. For example, if you leave London um, and then you now venture off to New York, you can see that the London time will be quite different because you've crossed 5 time zones. And that is why we will then suffer from jet lag. A few other factors that we need to take into consideration is that travel fatigue can subside by the next day. You know that we all feel better that when you arrive at your destination, you go for a quick shower and you feel better, or you have a good night's sleep. We need to remember, however, that travel fatigue can accumulate over the course of a season, and then it can become more persistent, and it can have a huge impact on the capacity of the athlete to recover, and of course on the performance as well. Jet lag, on the other hand, will not get better unless you get your body clock synchronized. So it will only resolve with resynchronization, and that is approximately 1 day per time zone cross. The severity will depend on a few things, and we know that between people it will differ, and also coming into play the chronotype that Shawnda has alluded to, the morning lark versus the night owl. Depending on what direction you're flying to, you may suffer more from jet lag going east than west, or west than east, depending on your chronotype. And then also important, the frequency of the trips, that will especially also add to the travel fatigue. And as Shawnda said, if you need to travel weekly from Tel Aviv to London, it's going to play up and cause problems for you regarding that circadian rhythm that we all have. So why is travel direction important? And the main reason is that you need to advance your clock if you go east. And we know that that is more difficult than delaying your clock. So when you travel west, you now need to shift your body clock backward, which most people find easier than when you need to advance your clock, like when you go from South Africa to New Zealand, for example. And there's a slight difference. So it will take you longer to recover from jet lag also when you go east. It's approximately 1.5 days per time zone, while for westward fly, we take it as 1 day per time zone. Now, how can we go about to try and beat jet lag? Firstly, we need to sort of try and measure the circadian phase, where the circadian rhythm is at when you travel. And the two probabilities, the one, the core body temperature minimum, that we know occur at approximately 4 a.m. in the morning. It's the most accurate, but unfortunately not very practical, as you need to do core temperature, which implies rectal measurements, and most athletes I know do not want me to do that, so it makes it difficult to use that measurement. On the other hand, the dim light melatonin onset, that is approximately 2 hours before your sleep onset. And it's perhaps less accurate, but definitely more practical. But let me show you on the graph below, if we now take a 7-hour time zone change, what this implies for your core body temperature minimum and your DLMO. And remember, you need your CBT min at its lowest for you to sleep at your best. So this is now your home time, 4 o'clock in the morning, CBT min. And if you go to sleep at 10, your DLMO at approximately 8 o'clock. Now, if you fly west, just look what happens to both of those measurements. So suddenly you now arrive 7 time zones from where you stay, and you can see that now your CBT min is sitting at 9 at night. So now suddenly you want to go to sleep too early, and you're going to be in deep sleep at 9 o'clock, while you will feel sleepy in the afternoon because of the dim light melatonin onset now sitting at 1 o'clock. If you go east, you will have it the other way around. So now your CBT min will be sitting at 11. So in the mornings when you need to be awake, you will feel sleepy. And then when you need to go to sleep, it's already early morning, but you can't wake up because of your late DLMO or your early morning DLMO, really. So what type of interventions do we have available to try and shift the CBT min and the DLMO? Light is definitely one of the most potent time cues, and we know that we need blue light to stimulate the SCN to try and get the circadian rhythm to move, and amber colors can block that blue light. So that's why you will see some of the sport teams nowadays travel with these big goggles with the yellow lenses. We know that natural light is better, and one should try and avoid screen time on the plane if you want to take a nap or you want to sleep. But when you arrive at your destination, it's now important to try and shift to your destination time. And the advice is that you will then try and get light. If you fly west, you want it pre your CBT min, 6 hours about. And if you fly east, you want that light intervention 6 hours post your CBT min. I'll show you a graph a bit later to make it more clear. And the evidence for light shifting the circadian rhythm is good. Sleep, Shawnda spent a lot of time on sleep, and sleep for now is seen as one of the most important interventions to try and help you to recover from jet lag. So you need to bank sleep. You don't want to get into sleep debt. And some people advise that you can try and move your sleep pattern already from pre-travel. That may make the estimation of your DLMO and CBT min a bit more difficult once you arrive at your destination. And the debate that I've talked about is previously people said that once you board the plane, immediately set your watch to the destination time. Nowadays, the clinicians are thinking that perhaps it's better to let the people sleep on the plane while they're tired and they're still in their home time. And then as soon as you arrive, you set your time to the destination time. And that will also help you to then estimate your CBT min and DLMO a bit better. We all know that caffeine is a stimulant, so you don't want to take it too close to bedtime. And alcohol is, although it will put you to sleep, it's going to also cause you to wake more. So we don't want people to take alcohol during the flight. And of course, the athletes definitely not when they arrive. I'm not going to spend time on good sleep hygiene. Shawnda covered that well, but we do know that power naps are very helpful. And for 20 to 30 minutes at a time, not too close to bedtime, and also good evidence for sleep to help to recover from jet lag. If we then look at the importance of exercise, we don't have good evidence to know that exercise will shift the circadian rhythm. And it is also important to take in mind when and what type of exercise and for what duration do you do the exercise. And the idea now is that you try and coincide your exercise sessions with that of your light avoidance and when you also want to apply light. The movement on the plane speaks for itself, and I've already mentioned the socks that you can wear, all the compression garments. So the advice is that when you arrive, you want to go into low to medium intensity exercise because you don't want to heighten the risk of injury. And we know that you have an increased risk of injury in the first few days after arrival. And then if you want to go to sleep, then the training session should not be too close to your bedtime. So we still need evidence on exercise and the effect on the circadian rhythm, but for now we do what I have just told you for our athletes. Regarding diet, I think we can all acknowledge that, you know, the different organs will have their own little clock. So that will also go for the gastrointestinal system. And unfortunately, no good evidence to suggest what you should eat at what time. People try to do that with the Oregon and the Harvard diets where they did a fasting, feasting recipe, but the methodology of those studies were really not good. You can go and have a look at those studies. So we can't follow that now as is. We need more evidence to show what time to eat what. On the plane, we advise that you stick to light energy meals, but try and stick to the flight schedule. Otherwise, it's just going to cause you more journey anxiety. Don't need to tell you more about how important hydration is, but to keep the alcohol out of that hydration recipe. And then also maybe just something to remember is that proteins will make you more alert, and then of course carbohydrates and fat will put you to sleep. And as I said, no good evidence yet. Melatonin, we know it is both a chronobiotic and a chronohypnotic hormone, so it can phase shift and it can also put you to sleep. The problem is that we're not always sure what product quality we're dealing with in the different countries. So we need to make sure that you use a good product that is clear. For obvious reasons, you don't want to run into world anti-doping regulation problems. There is a group of people that advise that you can consider to use melatonin. And now remember, I'm talking about exogenous melatonin, not endogenous. You can consider to use melatonin, but if you use it before you arrive, again, it may now complicate the estimation of your CBT min and DLMO. The advice is that if you want to use it when you arrive at your destination, if you fly west, so you now want to delay your clock, you use it 4 hours after your CBT min of your hometown. And then if you go east, you need to advance your clock, you use it 11.5 hours before your CBT min at home time. And also not very good evidence with melatonin and jet lag as yet. So we're waiting for studies. The problem is the field studies are difficult, it's expensive, and one should perhaps look at collaborative studies between different areas of the world to see if we can get the melatonin problem sorted out. Sleeping aids in the form of short-acting sleeping tablets may help if athletes are suffering, and of course also business travelers, but there's no evidence that one can use it safely in athletes. I consider it when it is an overnight flight, but then only in those athletes that really could tolerate it previously. But we need some hard evidence on that. And then a few other things that we can consider to use to try and recover quicker, the so-called melatonin agonists. And this is really one part that I do get excited about. There are nice studies on this, Rameltin and tasimeltin. mostly lab-based, but there is one field study, and it seems that it can actually help you to recover from jet lag. We don't exactly know what dose yet, and the timing is also still a problem, and it hasn't been tested in athletes, but it seemed promising. And the same for the melatonergic antidepressant agomelatine that's used to treat depressive symptoms that's associated with jet lag. The stimulants in the athlete group is difficult because it is mostly banned. Caffeine is allowed, but again, at night time, perhaps not a good idea. And then some new kids on the block. So the VIP antagonists and the salt-inducible kinase 1 receptors that sits in the brain. And if you can inhibit those, and it's been done in animal studies, it seems that if you can inhibit those, you actually get those mice to then recover quicker from lab-induced jet lag. Just always remember when you're working with athletes that we need to consider water regulations. And I refer here to the systematic review that we recently published in the BJSM on all these interventions and the evidence that we have available specifically relating to the athlete group. Now, if we go on to the travel scenario, so I'm going to take you from New York to Vilnius in Lithuania. So this will be a 7 time zone cross from west to east, with New York your home destination and Vilnius your destination time. And already you can see the difference in time. So at home, 6 in the morning, it's already 1300 in Vilnius. Luckily, we will not deal with a seasonal change as well. So what we need to consider, and this is now the rhythms that we're looking at. So the purple will be your home. So that is New York. And there you can see the melatonin curve. And then what you want is the turquoise curve when you arrive in Vilnius. The problem is what you can see here is that when you need to go to bed and you want your melatonin curve to be high, it's flat. So your melatonin bin is empty. You're not going to feel very sleepy. And like Shawnda said, your cortisol that needs to rise mid-morning, in this case, you can see it's still low. So you're going to feel tired for the first part of the morning. You still want to sleep because there you can see your melatonin rising now, but your cortisol is still low. And maybe just to make it a bit easier to explain, if we now look at the different times in Vilnius and then at home, which is New York, you can see that when you want to go to sleep, or it's dinner time here, it's only lunch time at home. And now when you need to go to sleep, you will still feel quite awake over here. There it is midnight in New York, and it's sort of for you now too early to want to go to bed. So let's take on the journey. We have 3 different options. You can go via Helsinki or Amsterdam or Vienna. So a few things that we need to take into consideration here. The flight duration, it's not a lot different. It's mostly different because of the layover time that you can see is quite different for the 3 options that we have available. And with the layover, if it's too short, you may stress because maybe you're missing your next flight and then you need to spend another day where you didn't want to. Or if it's too long, you can become fatigued or even frustrated. Remember now that if we want to go east, you need to advance your body clock, and that will take about 1.5 days per time zone crossed. Remember about your core body temperature minimum, because that is when you sleep at your easiest. It's approximately 3 to 6 in the morning, but you will have individual differences. So now light exposure and light avoidance comes into play. And if you go east, as I said, and you want to advance your body clock, it's best to get light exposure in the 6 hours after your CBT min at your home time. Because remember, your CBT min needs to shift, and it will take 1 to 1.5 days per time zone cross. And you need to shift this forward by 1 hour each day. And light avoidance will be the contrary. And maybe it's easier to see. I will show you on the graph now. This is then the arrival time that we need to decide which flight will be the best one to take. And if I show you this graph, for me, it's obvious that I want to take this one. I want to arrive round about 1 o'clock, because on the first day, you will then still be able to get a lot of light exposure that will help you to advance your clock. If you take the Helsinki flight, you will only be arriving 6 at night. So that may not be the best option unless you can go to bed immediately and go into the dark and avoid light, and to not shift your body clock into the wrong direction. So to me, from the 3 options, I will choose the flight via Vienna for the reasons explained. So to summarize, that when you arrive at your destination, if you want to use light as an intervention, if you want to delay your clock, so this is your CBT min over here. There is your normal sleep time at your home, and this is approximately, as I said, between 3 and 6 where the CBT min sits. So if you go west, you want to delay your clock, that is the D. So you want light exposure in the time before your CBT min, 3 to 6 hours before. If you want to advance, you want it after your CBT min. For melatonin, if you want to go west and delay, this will be the opposite to light. You now want it after your CBT min. And if you advance, you want it before your CBT min. As you can see, opposite to light. Exercise, you don't want to do that too close to bedtime, and maybe consider to reduce it the first 72 hours because of the higher risk for injury, and try and coincide that exercise sessions with the light exposure and avoidance that you planned. Sleep, very important. You can take your strategic naps, but not too close to bedtime. Do the good sleep hygiene like Shawnda explained to us, and align your sleep pattern to that of the destination as soon as you arrive. And then the nutrition, I think maybe that is the one area that can bring some answers and perhaps help athletes without the risk of crossing the doping regulations. That it, as I said, unfortunately, still need a lot of research. And what we know is that you need to be hydrated. I've many times said, although I also like my glass of wine, refrain from alcohol while traveling, and remember the role that proteins and the carbohydrates and fats can play. So to summarize, travel fatigue and jet lag are potentially modifiable, but there's still a lot of uncertainties on how we can advance and delay the body clock. So we unfortunately don't have a cure yet. What we know is very important will be to preserve sleep, do not get into sleep debt, and use light effectively on the right side of the CBT min, and to not shift the body clock in the wrong direction. Of course, if we travel, we need to take environmental conditions into consideration, like I said on my first slide, temperature changes, pollution, all of that, and then illness preventative measures. Now with COVID, we haven't traveled. It feels to me a bit like, you know, we're talking jet lag, but we can't travel. Hopefully soon we will be able to travel. And I think we're just all more aware of how important illness prevention actually is. And none of this can happen. You can't have a successful trip without meticulous planning. So I thank you for your time, and I don't know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to give answers. this is just to show you where I'm from, my country, South Africa. The city I live in, we call it the Jacaranda Stad because of all the nice purple flowers we have in October. And then, of course, the Big Five. That is part and parcel of my lovely country. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent talk with lots and lots of practical applications. And as you say, none of us are flying at the moment, so it kind of makes me miss jet lag somewhat. But hopefully we'll be able to explore that again soon. One of the questions that came to my mind from a sort of a European-centric model is you quite often, so lots of your examples will talk about how long it takes to sort of counteract the effects. Lots of European teams have to fly to maybe midweek competitions, and so they haven't got very long. They might be only in that country for 24 hours maybe. And there's quite a big debate about whether they should spend the entire trip on their home time zone or whether they should try and change. What would be your thoughts on the best approach for short trips that cover time zones?
For short trips, I agree that, I would say less than 3 days, it's better to stay at your home time, because you're not going to be able to then shift the body clock. But for longer times than that, it is better to adapt to, the new destination.
Okay, yeah, I think that's what they seem to mainly do. Thank you. Question from Koba Slaba. Hopefully I've pronounced that okay. So first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation. Good question here. He's asked if there are any objective parameters to determine recovery from jet lag. So are there some good measurements that you can use to say, yes, this person has overcome it or not?
No, there's no, and that is really, the problem with jet lag. I was surprised when we started to do that systematic review on how much or how little scientific evidence we really have. And nowadays, we mostly use subjective measurements. So you will use all the sleep diaries and the Liverpool jet lag questionnaire, those kinds of things. Objectively, we can use actigraphy to see, are the people sleeping better or not. Polysomnography is not an option when you travel. It's just too laborious. So unfortunately, no, not. So we're still working with the subjective measurements and then a bit of actigraphy in the background. And hopefully we can get that right in future, because it will really help, and I think another problem with is the sort of individual approach. How do you do that if you travel with a team of 30 players, for example? So that also comes into play, that you then do a general approach, but you have differences within your team.
If I could interject as well, I thought doing a systematic review as well, like you this year on jet lag, I thought I would see a figure that was like what you see with hypoxia research, where you have X number of days where SpO2 goes back to baseline, heart rate goes back to, you've got these different markers. And I thought you would see those markers, like you have markers that we can measure that we will know go back to baseline. So, core body temperature, melatonin release, when do those cycles start to realign again? And I was just really surprised that I did not find anything regarding that in a systematic way.
Absolutely right. And maybe it's something that we can tackle, going forward. As you said, some of those are easy to measure, like the oxygen saturation and heart rate. Core body temperature, maybe not as easy for obvious reasons. But yeah, most definitely, I agree. That's the way to go. The subjective measurements are not giving us answers.
Thank you. It's amazing. Like I said with Shawnda, it's amazing. This is something that everyone or many people do, but the data is not necessarily there. Last question I had, which was, again, the data might not be there, but I wondered whether there was any good data to quantify the actual effects of jet lag on any form of athletic or mental performance. Now, is there a good way of saying it has this much of a negative effect?
You can read Stephen's upcoming chapter 14 to get all those answers and more.
How do you mute her? How do you mute her?
There are some effects on cardiovascular system, neuromuscular works. There's a handful of papers, say between 6 to 8, as Christina was saying, or Christa was saying, with actual athletes, and 1 or 2 really good ones where they're going westward and eastward and testing them, like jump capacity, etc., at the destinations both ways. But the short answer for your question is no. I'll send you a couple of the papers. I would love to hear what your perspective is.
Yeah, no, I agree, Shawnda. And, you know, as I said previously, I was amazed. I sort of landed in jet lag per accident. You know, someone looked at me and asked, will you give this lecture on jet lag? And that was about 4 years back. And then when I started to read, I was amazed to see that there really is nothing. And, you know, perhaps a bit more in non-athlete populations. And as Chris said, so important, not only for athletes and business travelers, but what about the military? You know, those people going in dangerous situations. And even there, we don't have good research. Peter Fowler from Australia did quite a few studies on exercise performance of the traveling, you know, in football people. So those are maybe some of the studies that you are alluding to, but really not a lot of other studies out there. And I think maybe the biggest problem is to set up the study. You know, it's expensive to get people to buy in, especially if you work with athletes and maybe even soldiers. They don't want to be guinea pigs. You know, they focused on their whatever they need to go and do. They don't want you to measure something on their ear tip, or, you know, draw blood or something, and then to sort of standardize methodology to get them to do the subjective measurements. Even it is a challenge. It is a real challenge, and that's why we also have more laboratory-based studies, and I do think that we need field-based studies.
Fantastic. Well, obviously, once we're over this pandemic and people are back in the skies, then maybe some of those gaps will slowly get filled. Well, thank you both again for two excellent talks. The first time we've had this topic in the series, and it's been a great double header. 2 weeks time, we will have a session on diving physiology. So it'll be the first time that we go beneath the surface. So another new topic for us. This talk will be available on our YouTube page and on the Twitter page shortly, and then as will the registration details for the diving physiology talk. But thank you all for attending, and thank you to Christa and Shawnda once again for delivering two excellent talks.
Thank you.